Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, I'm going to talk about something that sits at an uncomfortable intersection between Korean tradition and something much darker. We're talking about the Baekil ritual, the 100-day mourning period that Korean families observe after someone dies. It's meant to be respectful, meant to guide the deceased spirit peacefully into the afterlife. But what I'm about to share with you is about what happens when that ritual forces secrets to surface, when the sacred space meant for honoring the dead becomes a mechanism for revealing what the dead spent their entire lives hiding. And what happens when that liminal space becomes a mechanism for revelation instead? When the room meant to honor the dead starts forcing buried secrets into the light, secrets the family was never supposed to discover. This is about a woman who I will call Ji-woo, and what she found in her grandmother's room during those 100 days. Ji-woo's grandmother died on a Tuesday in April, 3 weeks after her 82nd birthday, in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and the particular staleness that accumulates in spaces where people go to die. The funeral followed traditional structure. 3 days at the hospital mortuary, the air thick with incense smoke and chrysanthemums, visitors arriving in steady waves to bow before the altar, where her grandmother's photograph sat in a simple black frame, serene in that way elderly people sometimes achieve when they've made peace with mortality. Ji-woo had been her grandmother's favorite, a fact everyone in the family knew, but rarely spoke about directly. Her grandmother had taught her how to make kimchi with the right proportions of spice and garlic, how to fold clothes so the creases fell in precise lines, how to move through social situations with quiet authority that commanded respect without drawing unnecessary attention. The grandmother had been well regarded in their Seoul neighborhood, known as someone you could go to when Western medicine failed, when accumulated bad luck seemed to follow your family like a shadow, when regular doctors had done everything they could and there was still something wrong that couldn't be diagnosed through conventional means. After the funeral, Ji-woo's mother explained the requirements of Baekil, the 100-day mourning ritual that would structure the next several months of their lives. Her grandmother's room on the second floor, the traditional hanok that had been in the family for 3 generations, would remain exactly as she'd left it. Each morning, someone would enter to leave fresh offerings on the small wooden altar. Rice, water, 3 sticks of incense, meant to carry prayers to wherever spirits went during their transitional period. The ritual was designed to guide the deceased through the 100 days it supposedly took for a soul to fully separate from the living world and move into whatever came after. It's important we do this correctly, her mother said, and Ji-woo noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. She deserves that, after everything she did for this family. The smell began subtly enough that Ji-woo almost didn't register it as a change at all. For the first few weeks after the funeral, the room smelled exactly as it always had. Medicinal herbs her grandmother had brewed into teas for neighbors, the mustiness of fabric stored in wooden chests too long, faint traces of ointments made from recipes passed down through generations. It was comforting, in its way, the olfactory signature of a person who had been present and real, whose belongings still carried evidence of her existence. But somewhere in the 3rd week, Ji-woo started noticing something underneath the familiar scents, threading through them in a way that didn't quite belong, but wasn't alarming enough to mention. At first, she thought it might be the incense they were burning daily. Different brands had different qualities, some more acrid than others. Or perhaps it was simply the room adjusting to being unoccupied, releasing smells that had been trapped in walls for years. Within another few weeks, though, the smell had transformed entirely, And one morning, Ji-woo opened the door to leave offerings and was hit by something that made her step back involuntarily. The incense was still there, but underneath it was something burnt in a way that went beyond controlled ritual burning. Something organic and deeply wrong. It smelled like hair held too close to a candle flame and singed, or like meat left on a grill until the edges charred black and started smoking. The smell of something valuable being consumed and destroyed. Ji-woo started wearing a mask when she entered the room. Her mother noticed but didn't comment, and Ji-woo wondered if that meant her mother smelled it too and simply didn't want to acknowledge it, or if grief was distorting perceptions in ways that made wrongness appear where there was only ordinary sadness. Late one night, maybe a month into the ritual, Ji-woo woke suddenly from a dream she couldn't remember and found herself standing in the hallway outside her grandmother's room with no clear memory of having gotten out of bed. The house was completely dark except for faint ambient light from street lamps, and for a moment she just stood there, disoriented, trying to understand what had pulled her from sleep. Then she heard it, chanting, quiet enough that she might have missed it if the house hadn't been so silent, but unmistakable once she registered what she was hearing. Rhythmic syllables in a language that sounded like Korean but older, the words worn smooth by repetition, the way river stones lose their sharp edges over centuries. It wasn't modern Korean, not the language Ji-woo spoke daily or heard on television, but something more formal, more archaic, the kind that existed in historical texts and traditional ceremonies performed outside official religious institutions. Underneath the chanting, she could hear breathing, sustained and deliberate, like wind moving through a narrow space. And beneath that, something being struck at regular intervals, wood on wood or metal on metal, marking time in a way that felt significant. She stood frozen, her hand halfway to the door handle, listening to sounds that shouldn't exist coming from a room where no one was supposed to be, except her grandmother's possessions and the daily offerings meant to guide a spirit through transition. The chanting continued without variation, steady as a heartbeat, and Ji-woo had the sudden irrational certainty that it had been going on for hours before she'd woken and would continue for hours after she left. She turned around and went back to her room, lay in bed with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, constructing explanations she almost believed by morning. Her mother brought it up a week later over breakfast, casual in the way people are when they're testing whether you'll confirm something they're afraid to believe. I thought I heard something last night from Mother's room, like talking maybe, or the building settling. Ji-woo looked up from her rice. What time? Late, 2 or 3 in the morning. I got up to use the bathroom and heard it when I passed by her door. Her mother's expression held a desperate hope that Ji-woo would provide a rational explanation. You haven't noticed anything? Probably just the pipes, Ji-woo said, watching her mother's face relax slightly, watching her accept the explanation because the alternative was too complicated to face. Old houses make all kinds of sounds, especially at night when everything else is quiet. They finished breakfast without discussing it further, both of them pretending they believed the lie they'd just constructed together. But Ji-woo couldn't let it go. A few nights later, she positioned herself in the hallway at 2 in the morning, sitting with her back against the wall opposite her grandmother's door. The house was silent around her, her mother asleep, the street outside empty. She sat there for maybe 20 minutes, fighting sleep, wondering if this was pointless. Then the chanting started, emerging gradually, so quiet at first that Ji-woo thought she might be imagining it, but within a minute, It had grown distinct enough that there was no mistaking what she was hearing. The same rhythmic syllables, the same archaic cadence, all of it coming from behind the closed door of a room that contained nothing but a dead woman's belongings and accumulated offerings. Ji-woo stood. Her legs had gone numb from sitting, and pins and needles shot through them as circulation returned. She moved toward the door, put her hand on the cold metal handle, and for a moment just stood there, paralyzed by the gap between what she knew should be on the other side and what she was about to find. She turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was empty. Her grandmother's clothes still hung in the closet. Personal items sat on the dresser exactly where she'd left them. The altar held offerings Ji-woo had placed that morning. Everything was as it should be, except for the sound that continued to fill the space, not coming from walls or floor, but somehow emanating from the room itself, as if the space had absorbed something during the decades her grandmother had lived in it and was now releasing it back. Ji-woo stepped inside, and the chanting grew slightly louder, responding to her presence. She moved toward the closet where the burnt smell was strongest. The syllables were clearer now. She could almost make out individual words, though their meanings remained locked in whatever old form of the language they belonged to. She reached for the closet handle, and the moment her fingers made contact, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Not just absence of sound, but pressure against her eardrums, a vacuum that made her acutely aware of her own heartbeat. Ji-woo's hand trembled on the handle. She pulled the door open. At the back of the closet, partially hidden behind hanging clothes, was something wrapped in yellowed cloth tied with frayed string. She pulled it out, surprised by its weight. Heavier than fabric should be, dense in a way that suggested it contained something more than just cloth. She unwound the string, and the cloth fell open to reveal a robe made of expensive silk, embroidered with symbols she didn't recognize. Geometric patterns and circular designs that resembled talismans, but were subtly different in ways that suggested a different tradition, different beliefs. The robe smelled like the burnt scent that had been permeating the room, as if it had been exposed to smoke so deeply that the smell had become part of its fundamental structure. Her grandmother had never worn anything like this, at least not in any context Ji-woo had witnessed. She looked back into the closet. If there was one hidden object, there would be others. She moved aside hanging clothes, pushed away shoes, pulled down boxes from shelves, and found more items tucked into corners and wrapped in cloth, with the kind of deliberate care that suggested someone who knew exactly what they were doing and wanted to make sure these things wouldn't be found unless someone was specifically looking. Photographs, dozens of them, stacked in no particular order. Ji-woo spread them out on the closet floor. Many showed her grandmother in settings she didn't recognize, standing before altars in unfamiliar rooms, surrounded by people wearing robes similar to the one she'd just found, holding objects that looked ceremonial. In several photographs, her grandmother stood next to a man Ji-woo had never seen before, someone older with sharp, intense features and eyes that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it. He appeared across multiple images spanning different years, always positioned centrally. Beneath the photographs were notebooks, 4 of them, bound in cloth covers faded from red to brownish pink. Ji-woo picked up the one on top and opened it to a random page. The handwriting was her grandmother's. She recognized it immediately, those careful characters formed with precision, but the content was completely unfamiliar. Some dated from the 1970s, some from just a few years ago. The clinical language, the mention of payments, the references to someone called the Master, the way her grandmother had documented suffering with the same careful attention she'd used to write grocery lists. At the back of the fourth notebook, tucked between the last page and the inside cover, Ji-woo found scraps of paper, each containing a name, date, and sometimes a notation. Some names had been crossed out with thick black lines. Others had notes: completed, transferred, discontinued, deceased. One name made Ji-woo's hands start shaking. Choi, MH, sister, 1982, high receptivity, master approved, begin intensive preparation Choi Mi-hee. Her mother's older sister who had died when Ji-woo was a baby. The aunt the family never talked about. And here was her name in her grandmother's careful hand, listed as a recruit, documented through multiple sessions with a final notation: discontinued, unstable, transitioned. Ji-woo sat on the floor of her grandmother's closet, surrounded by photographs and notebooks and scraps of paper, and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of who her grandmother had been. She started researching late at night when her mother was asleep, searching for names online, obituaries, old news articles, census records. Of the 18 names she could verify, 6 were dead, 3 official suicides, 2 sudden medical events in otherwise healthy people. One accident described vaguely in articles, as if details were too disturbing to report fully. She found a phone number for Park Min-ho and called without planning what she'd say. "I'm calling about my grandmother," she said when he answered. "I know who she was," he said quietly. "How did you get my number?" "I found notebooks. Your name was in them." "Meet me tomorrow. I'll tell you what I can." They met at a cafe far from Ji-woo's neighborhood. Park Min-ho was in his 60s now, nervous, kept glancing at the door. "I was 16 when my mother brought me to your grandmother. We were having problems. Money, my father's drinking. Your grandmother said she could help, said our family had accumulated hand that needed cleansing. The first sessions had seemed normal. Prayers, incense, reassurance. Then her grandmother introduced him to someone called the Master, an older man who had a way of making you feel like he could see inside you, who told Park Min-ho that his family was the source of his suffering, that true healing required separation. Over 3 years, Park Min-ho had been drawn deeper, living part-time in a house with other members, participating in rituals that lasted all night involving fasting and sleep deprivation, giving money until he had nothing left and was borrowing from friends under false pretenses. "Your grandmother documented everything," he said. "What I said during sessions, how I responded to rituals, whether I was progressing or resisting. She reported it all to the Master. He'd tried to leave twice. The first time they told him he couldn't leave until his cycle was complete. The second time they warned him that leaving would result in curses that would follow him forever. He'd left anyway at 20, moved to Seoul, cut all contact. But for years I felt like something was following me. Relationships fell apart. Jobs didn't work out. I don't know if it was a real curse or just psychological damage. Maybe there's no difference." He looked at Ji-woo directly. "Your grandmother seemed kind. That's what made it hard to leave. She held my hand while I signed over my savings and called it a blessing." Over the following weeks, Ji-woo tracked down 4 more people. Each conversation was a variation on the same story. Initial help that seemed genuine, gradual escalation into exploitation, isolation from questioning families, financial contributions that grew larger, rituals that crossed boundaries in ways that left lasting damage. One woman described being told her dead child's spirit was trapped in suffering, that the only way to release the child was through increasingly expensive ceremonies, She'd given tens of thousands of dollars over 2 years before her husband physically dragged her away. An elderly woman described witnessing a ritual where a younger member collapsed. Instead of calling for medical help, the master insisted it was spiritual breakthrough. By the time they sought medical attention, the woman had suffered permanent neurological damage. Ji-woo documented everything, created timelines, mapped connections. The scope was staggering. Her grandmother had been part of this for over 40 years, had recruited dozens of people, had documented their progress as they were isolated, exploited, sometimes permanently harmed. And she'd done it all while being the grandmother Ji-woo remembered, gentle, patient, the person who taught her how to be careful with fragile things. The room's wrongness intensified as Ji-woo's understanding deepened. Shadows started falling at angles that didn't match light sources, as if the laws governing how light should behave had stopped applying within that specific space. The doorway looked deeper than it should, not like it opened onto the hallway, but onto some other space entirely. Objects cast multiple shadows from single lamps, each shadow falling in a different direction. Time became unreliable in ways that went beyond simple disorientation. Ji-woo would enter to leave morning offerings and emerge to find it was afternoon, her knees aching like she'd been kneeling for hours, though she had no memory of the time passing. Her mother would go in for what felt like minutes and come out hours later, unable to account for the missing time, her expression vacant in a way that suggested she'd been somewhere else entirely. Once Ji-woo entered and found herself standing by the window with no memory of having walked there, the light outside transformed from morning to evening, her body registering hours of physical stillness she couldn't recall experiencing. Late one night, she saw a figure standing by the altar. Not her grandmother, but a shape that was humanoid without being human, as if shadow had learned to hold itself upright and mimic the general structure of a person without committing to actual form. It didn't move, just stood there watching, and Ji-woo backed out of the room and closed the door with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Her mother found the notebooks by accident, looking for something in Ji-woo's room and opening the wrong drawer. The confrontation happened in the kitchen with one of the notebooks open on the table between them, her mother's face pale and rigid. What is this? Documentation of things grandmother was involved in. This isn't possible. Her mother's voice carried the strain of someone trying to hold something together that was already breaking. My mother was a healer. She helped people. She did both, Ji-woo said, each word feeling like she was placing stones one by one, building something that would outlast this conversation. She helped people, and she harmed people, sometimes the same people. Her mother stood abruptly, the chair scraping against floor. Why are you doing this? She's dead. She can't defend herself. All you're doing is... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, unable to name what Ji-woo was doing, because naming it would require acknowledging it was real. What about the people she hurt while she was alive? Ji-woo asked. Her mother left the kitchen without answering, and Ji-woo heard her bedroom door close with the careful control of someone who wanted to slam it but couldn't allow herself that release. Ji-woo's uncle arrived from the United States 3 days later. Her mother had called him, told him it was urgent. When he saw the notebook spread across the living room table, his reaction was immediate and absolute. We burn them. We can't just... Ji-woo started. Yes, we can. His voice was firm in the way people sound when they've already decided and are simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. She's dead. She can't be punished, can't make amends. All this does is hurt the people who loved her. What about the people she hurt? How does exposing this help them? Her uncle's hands gestured toward the notebooks as if they were evidence at a trial. They've moved on, built lives. Dragging this up now doesn't give them justice. It just reopens wounds. You don't know what they want, Jiwoo said. Some of them might want acknowledgement, and some might want to forget. He looked at Jiwoo's mother, then back at Jiwoo. We need to decide together. They sat in the living room with evidence spread across the coffee table, like bodies at a crime scene. Her uncle didn't wait for a consensus. He reached across the table, his fingers closing around the stack of notebooks. We're done talking. These go in the incinerator tonight. Jiwoo slammed her hand down on the covers before he could pull them away. You're not destroying evidence. It's not evidence, it's poison, her uncle snapped, his voice rising for the first time. She's gone. This doesn't help anyone. All it does is destroy the reputation of this family. It's the truth, Jiwoo said. She looked at her mother. Tell him. Her mother's hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. She looked physically ill, caught between the brother, who wanted to erase the past, and the daughter, who wanted to exhume it. We can't burn them, her mother whispered, her voice trembling. That's her handwriting. That's part of her. It's the part that ruined people's lives, Jiwoo said. If you burn these, I go to the police. I don't need the notebooks to tell them what she did. I'll make sure the investigation happens either way. Her uncle froze. He looked at Jiwoo, seeing the threat wasn't a bluff, then slowly released his grip on the notebooks. He sat back, disgust written across his face. Then you destroy us all, he said. There was no agreement between the two, just a terrifying stalemate where everyone kept their secrets because they were too afraid of what would happen if they let go. The silence that followed was the sound of a family fracturing along fault lines that had always been there but had never been tested until now. They couldn't agree on what honoring truth meant, couldn't agree on whether justice required exposure or protection, couldn't agree on whether the dead deserved grace or condemnation, or something more complicated than either word could capture. And upstairs in her grandmother's room, the manifestations continued their escalation towards something none of them could predict or control. Day 100 arrived without ceremony or resolution. The family gathered at sunset in Jiwoo's grandmother's room, the space where they'd spent the past 100 days trying to maintain a ritual that had long since transformed into something else entirely. Jiwoo stood beside her mother and uncle, all three of them facing the altar that held months of accumulated offerings, and understood that they were about to attempt something that couldn't succeed because they hadn't resolved anything, hadn't agreed on what they believed about the person they were supposed to be honoring. Her mother began the traditional prayers, speaking the words that were meant to release a spirit from its transitional state and guide it peacefully into whatever comes after death. Her voice shook as she spoke, betraying the conflict underneath the formal language. She was trying to honor her mother's memory while simultaneously holding knowledge of what her mother had done, trying to perform reverence while feeling something more complicated than reverence. Jiwoo and her uncle joined in, adding their voices to prayers that felt hollow the moment they left their mouths, words that wouldn't stick to anything because there was nothing stable for them to stick to. The room responded to their failed attempt with intensification rather than release. The temperature dropped sharply enough that their breath became visible. The shadows along the walls deepened and began moving in ways that had nothing to do with the lamp's position, and the figures that had been appearing intermittently throughout the final weeks of the ritual all manifested simultaneously. Dozens of them now, maybe more, lining the walls and filling the corners, shapes that might have been people, or might have been accumulated resentment given temporary form. Her mother's voice faltered, the prayers trailing off mid-sentence as she realized what everyone in the room could feel, that the ritual wasn't working, that they were trying to release a spirit while simultaneously condemning the person that spirit had been, and that contradiction was preventing any kind of resolution from occurring. Ji-woo stopped speaking entirely. The words had become meaningless in her mouth, and continuing to say them felt like lying to forces that could see through the lie more clearly than she could see through it herself. "We can't do this," she said, into the silence that followed the failed prayers. Her mother turned to look at her, expression stricken. "What are we supposed to do then?" "I don't know," Ji-woo said, and the honesty of not knowing felt more real than any of the prayers they'd been attempting. "Maybe we just leave it. Leave the room the way it is. Leave everything unresolved, because that's what's actually true. We haven't resolved anything, and pretending we have won't make the ritual work." Her uncle made a sound that might have been protest or agreement, or simply exhausted resignation. "That's not how Baekil works." "I know," Ji-woo said, "but I think that's what has to happen anyway." They stood in the room for a long time after that, none of them moving, none of them speaking, the prayers hanging, unfinished in the air while the offerings sat untouched on the altar and the incense burned down to nothing. And slowly, not dramatically, but gradually, like a storm deciding to move in a different direction, rather than dissipating entirely, the manifestations shifted. The temperature stopped dropping, though it didn't return to normal. The shadows stopped their erratic movement and settled into patterns that remained wrong, but became predictable. The figures along the walls stopped pressing forward and simply stood, bearing witness to the family's inability to complete what they'd started. The room didn't return to normal and wouldn't return to normal, but it found a new state that felt less hostile than it had moments before, suspended somewhere between the living world and whatever lay beyond it, waiting for something that might never come. They left without finishing the ritual, and Ji-woo was the last one out, standing in the doorway looking back at the space that had dominated months of her life and would continue to dominate it in different ways now that she understood what it contained. Day 101 arrived and nothing changed. The room remained in its suspended state, the smell persisting like a signature that couldn't be erased, the sounds continuing whenever someone stood outside the door late at night and listened, the temporal disturbances making it impossible for anyone to spend more than a few minutes inside without losing track of whether they'd been there for seconds or hours. The family didn't clean out the room, didn't repurpose it, didn't try to force it back into being an ordinary space, because they understood it had become something else, and pretending otherwise would be another form of dishonesty stacked on top of all the other dishonesty that had brought them to this point. Ji-woo kept the notebooks, the photographs, the list of names. She contacted everyone she could reach, asked them what they wanted. Some wanted silence, and she gave them that. Some wanted acknowledgement, and she gave them that too, sitting with each person's story and offering apologies that felt inadequate, but were all she had to offer. Mostly she just carried the knowledge, the weight of understanding that her grandmother had been both the person who taught her gentleness and the person who had caused immense harm, that these weren't contradictory versions, but simultaneous realities that existed in the same life, in the same body, without ever being reconciled, because reconciliation wasn't possible. Somewhere in the city, people her grandmother had hurt continued their lives, some healed, some still broken, most not knowing that the person who'd harmed them was dead, or that her secrets had been discovered, or that her family had chosen neither full exposure nor complete burial, but something more complicated that acknowledged harm without resolving it. And in the room on the second floor of her mother's house, the presence remained. The smell lingered, sharp and wrong. The shadows fell at impossible angles. Time moved in its own rhythm, disconnected from the clocks in the rest of the house, bearing witness to what had been done in that space across decades.